The stench of diesel and cold sweat clung to me as I floored the accelerator, my rig roaring down the empty highway. In my side mirror, the rest stop's neon sign faded into the night, along with the men who'd tried to end my life. I'd been driving trucks for 15 years, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened back there. Nothing. It started like any other haul. I'd picked up a load of electronics in Memphis, bound for a warehouse in Albuquerque. The manifest said it was all above board, laptops, tablets, the usual stuff, but something felt off from the get-go. The shipping agent was too nervous, his eyes darting around like he expected trouble. Should have trusted my gut right then and there. I'd been on the road for about 10 hours when fatigue started creeping in. You know how it is. Your eyelids get heavy, the white lines on the road start to blur. I knew I needed to pull over soon or risk falling asleep at the wheel. That's when I saw the sign for the Cactus Rose rest stop, promising hot coffee and clean restrooms. It was the middle of nowhere, New Mexico, but beggars can't be choosers. The parking lot was deserted when I pulled in, just a couple of other semis and a beat-up RV. The place looked like it hadn't been updated since the 70s. Faded paint, flickering lights, the whole 9 yards. But it was a port in the storm, and I was desperate for a break. I climbed down from the cab, my boots crunching on the gravel. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of sage and dust. For a moment, I just stood there, stretching my cramped muscles and enjoying the stillness of the desert night. That's when I noticed him, a guy leaning against the wall of the rest stop, smoking a cigarette. He was trying too hard to look casual, his eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I nodded in his direction, playing it cool, but my instincts were screaming that something wasn't right. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed, casting a sickly glow over the empty dining area. The place was deserted, not even a sleepy cashier behind the counter. I made my way to the coffee machine, my footsteps echoing in the silence. As I poured myself a cup of what looked like tar, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on my back. I turned, half expecting to see the smoking man right behind me, but there was no one there. Just rows of empty tables and chairs, their red vinyl seats cracked and peeling. I took a sip of coffee, grimacing at the bitter taste, and decided it was time to hit the road again. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of my rig's air brakes being released. My heart leapt into my throat. I sprinted for the door, coffee forgotten, adrenaline surging through my veins. As I burst into the parking lot, I saw my worst fears confirmed. 2 men were climbing into my truck, the engine already rumbling to life. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice echoing across the empty lot. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" They turned, startled by my sudden appearance. In the harsh glare of the security lights, I caught a glimpse of hard eyes and cruel smiles. One of them reached into his jacket, and the glint of metal told me all I needed to know. I dove behind a nearby car just as the first shot rang out. The sound was deafening in the quiet night, followed by the ping of a bullet ricocheting off metal. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. This wasn't a simple truck theft. These guys were playing for keeps. "Come on out, driver," a gravelly voice called. "We don't want to hurt you, we just need your cargo." I didn't believe that for a second. My eyes darted around looking for an escape route, a weapon, anything. That's when I spotted it, a rusty crowbar lying in the bed of a pickup truck a few yards away. "All right," I called back, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm coming out, don't shoot." I heard footsteps approaching, crunching on the gravel. Slowly I began to stand, hands raised. The 2 men came into view, one holding a pistol, the other empty-handed, but looking no less dangerous. "That's it," the gunman said, a smirk playing on his lips. "Nice and easy." I took a step forward, then another. They relaxed slightly, thinking they had me cornered. That's when I made my move. I lunged for the crowbar, snatching it up and swinging in one fluid motion. It connected with the gunman's wrist with a sickening crack. He howled in pain, the pistol clattering to the ground. His partner reacted quickly, charging at me like a bull. I sidestepped, using his momentum against him. He stumbled past, off balance, and I brought the crowbar down on his back. He went down hard, gasping for air. But the gunman was already recovering, reaching for his fallen weapon with his good hand. I didn't give him the chance. I swung the crowbar again, catching him in the ribs. He crumpled, curling into a ball and wheezing. For a moment I just stood there, panting, the crowbar clutched in my trembling hands. The whole thing had lasted maybe 30 seconds, but it felt like hours. My mind was reeling, trying to process what had just happened. That's when I heard the sound of an engine revving. I spun around to see my rig pulling away, the smoking man from earlier behind the wheel. In the chaos, I'd completely forgotten about him. "No!" I shouted, sprinting after the truck, but it was useless. There was no way I could catch up on foot. I watched helplessly as my rig, my livelihood, disappeared into the night. The sound of sirens in the distance snapped me back to reality. Someone must have heard the gunshot and called the cops. I looked down at the two men groaning on the ground, then at the crowbar in my hands. How was I going to explain all this? I made a split-second decision. I couldn't wait for the cops, not with my truck speeding away with who knows what in the trailer. I ran to the nearest semi, praying the driver had left the keys. Luck was on my side. The key was in the ignition, and the engine roared to life as I turned it. I felt a pang of guilt for stealing another driver's rig, but I told myself I'd make it right later. Right now, I had to catch up to my truck. I peeled out of the parking lot just as the first police car came into view, its lights painting the desert in red and blue. In my mirror, I saw the cops swarming the rest stop, but their attention was focused on the two men on the ground. No one tried to follow me. For the next hour, I pushed that borrowed rig to its limits, my eyes scanning the dark highway for any sign of my stolen truck. My mind was racing, trying to piece together what was happening. Who were those men? What was really in my trailer that was worth killing for? Finally, I spotted it. The familiar outline of my rig, pulled over on the side of the road. As I got closer, I could see the smoking man arguing with someone on a cell phone, gesticulating wildly. I didn't hesitate. I pulled up behind my truck and leapt out, crowbar in hand. The smoking man's eyes widened in surprise and fear as I approached. "Keys," I growled, holding out my hand. "Now." He hesitated for a moment, then seemed to deflate. He tossed me the keys without a word, then took off running into the desert night. I let him go. I had what I came for. As I climbed back into my own rig, my hands shaking with leftover adrenaline, I knew this night was far from over. Whatever was in my trailer, it had made me a target, and something told me those men at the rest stop were just the beginning. I started the engine, my mind already racing ahead to what I needed to do next. Find a phone, call my dispatcher, maybe even the FBI. But first, I had to put as many miles between me and that rest stop as possible. As I pulled back onto the highway, the events of the night replayed in my mind. In just a few short hours, my simple haul had turned into a nightmare of violence and mystery. But one thing was clear, I was in this now, whether I liked it or not. And I had a feeling that what started at that lonely rest stop was just the beginning of a much bigger, much more dangerous story. The open road stretched out before me, dark and full of unknowns. But for the first time in my career, I wasn't sure where it would lead me, or if I'd make it out alive. Story 2. I never thought I'd be grateful for a blown tire, but that rubber giving out saved my life. As I stood on the shoulder of a road I shouldn't have been on, watching the flickering taillights of the sedan that had been tailing me disappear around a bend, I knew I'd just dodged a bullet, literally. It all started about 6 hours earlier. I was at the depot in Fresno, California, loading up my rig with a shipment of fresh produce bound for a distribution center in Salt Lake City. It was a route I'd driven 100 times before, straight shot east on I-80. Nothing to it, or so I thought. The afternoon sun was beating down as I climbed into the cab, the familiar smell of leather and diesel welcoming me home. I fired up the engine, feeling that satisfying rumble beneath me. One last check of the manifest, a quick glance at my route on the GPS, and I was pulling out of the lot. The first couple hours were smooth sailing. The Central Valley stretched out around me, endless fields of green giving way to the rolling foothills of the Sierra Nevada. I had the radio on low, humming along to some old country tune, my mind already drifting to the hot shower and soft bed waiting for me in Salt Lake. It was just past Truckee when things started to get weird. My GPS chirped, announcing a route change due to construction ahead. Now, detours aren't uncommon in our line of work, but something about this one felt off. The new route was taking me north, way off I-80 and onto some back roads I'd never heard of. I tried to pull up the traffic report on my phone, but the signal was spotty in the mountains. Frustration gnawed at me as I weighed my options. Stick to the road I knew, possibly hitting hours of delays, or trust the GPS and take this mystery detour. In the end, time won out. I had a deadline to meet, and the thought of sitting in construction traffic for hours made my decision for me. I took the exit the GPS indicated, leaving the familiar interstate behind. At first, it wasn't so bad. The road wound through dense pine forests, the late afternoon sun filtering through the trees, but as the miles ticked by, an uneasy feeling settled in my gut. The roads were getting narrower, the towns fewer and farther between. My phone had lost signal entirely, and the fuel gauge was dipping lower than I liked. That's when I noticed the sedan. Dark blue, nondescript, it had been behind me for the last hour or so. Out here, on these empty roads, that was more than just a coincidence. I tried to shake it off, tell myself I was being paranoid, but every instinct I had was screaming that something wasn't right. As if on cue, my radio crackled to life. I nearly jumped out of my skin, my heart pounding as a voice cut through the static. "Hey there, driver. Looks like you took a wrong turn." I didn't respond, my hands tightening on the wheel. The voice came again, smoother this time, almost friendly. "Now don't go doing anything stupid. We've got some business to discuss, you and I. Take your next right and we'll talk." My mind was racing. Who were these people? What did they want? I glanced in my mirror, saw the sedan was still there, keeping pace. As the right turn approached, I made a split-second decision. I hit the gas. The engine roared as I pushed the rig to its limits, barreling past the turn. In my mirror, I saw the sedan accelerate, closing the gap. The radio crackled again, all pretense of friendliness gone. "Bad move, driver, last chance. Pull over now or things get messy." I ignored it, focusing on the road ahead. The turns were getting sharper, the shoulder narrower. I was driving by instinct now, taking each curve as fast as I dared. The sedan was right on my tail, so close I couldn't see its headlights in my mirrors. That's when I heard it, the sharp crack of gunfire. My side mirror exploded in a shower of glass and metal. They were shooting at me. Panic surged through me, my heart pounding so hard I could barely hear the engine. I was looking for anything. A turn-off, a wider stretch of road, anything that might give me an advantage. But out here, in the middle of nowhere, options were limited. I just kept driving, pushing my rig to its absolute limit, praying I could outlast them. And then, like an answer to that prayer, I heard the boom. Felt the truck lurch to the side. One of my tires had blown, the rubber shredded by the punishing pace. For a moment, sheer terror gripped me. I was done for. But then training kicked in. I fought the wheel, guiding the truck to the narrow shoulder, the metal rims sparking against the asphalt as I struggled to keep control. I don't know if it was luck or skill that kept me from jackknifing right there. Somehow I managed to bring the rig to a stop, the engine ticking as it cooled. The sedan blazed past me, brake lights flaring as it skidded around the next bend. For a long moment, I just sat there, hands shaking on the wheel, waiting for them to come back. But the road remained empty. The only sound was my own ragged breathing and the faint hiss of steam from the engine. Slowly, limbs heavy with fading adrenaline, I climbed down from the cab. The cool mountain air hit me like a slap, grounding me in reality. This was really happening. I wasn't dreaming. I walked around to the blown tire, wincing at the damage. That's when I noticed something odd, a small, blinking device attached to the underside of the trailer. With trembling hands, I pried it loose. A tracker. They'd been following me from the start. The implications hit me like a truck. This wasn't random. They knew what I was carrying, had planned this whole thing. But why? What was so valuable about a load of produce? I climbed back into the cab, my mind racing. I needed to call for help, but my phone was still useless out here. The radio was my only option. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the dial. What if they were listening? In the end, I decided I had no choice. I had to risk it. I keyed the mic, cleared my throat, and sent out a distress call, giving my location as best I could. Then I waited, every muscle tense, straining to hear the sound of an approaching engine. Minutes ticked by, feeling like hours. The shadows lengthened as the sun dipped below the mountaintops. I kept the tracker clutched in my hand, half expecting it to explode or something. Finally, I heard it, the distant wail of sirens. Relief flooded through me, so intense it was almost painful. As the flashing lights appeared around the bend, I stepped out of the cab, waving my arms. The next few hours were a blur. Highway patrol, then state police, then even the FBI showed up. I told my story over and over, watched them swarm over my truck, pulling apart pallets of lettuce and tomatoes. It was one of the FBI agents who finally filled me in. Turns out my produce shipment had an extra ingredient, about 200 kilos of cocaine hidden in secret compartments. I'd been an unwitting mule for a major drug cartel. As I sat in the back of an ambulance, a shock blanket around my shoulders, the full weight of what had happened started to sink in. I'd been set up, nearly killed, all because someone had decided to use my honest work as a cover for their smuggling operation. The agent assured me I wasn't in any trouble, that it was clear I had no idea what I'd been carrying. But as I watched them load the drugs into evidence vans, a cold realization settled over me. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The cartel had lost a fortune tonight, and they knew my face, my name. Even with police protection, how long would it be before they tried again? How could I ever feel safe on the road knowing what I knew now? As the first light of dawn broke over the mountains, I made a decision. I couldn't go back to my old life, not after this. It was time for a change, time to leave the open road behind. I watched the sun rise, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. It was beautiful, the kind of view I'd seen 1,000 times from behind the wheel. But now it felt like a goodbye. To the road, to the life I'd known, to the person I'd been when I started this trip. Whatever came next, whatever challenges lay ahead, I knew one thing for certain. I'd never look at a routine haul the same way again. In this business, you never really know what you're carrying or who might be coming for it. And sometimes a blown tire might just be the thing that saves your life. Story 3. I should have known better than to pick up a hitchhiker. Mama always said nothing good comes from letting strangers into your cab. But as I watched the man I knew as Jack being led away in handcuffs, surrounded by a sea of flashing blue and red lights, I realized just how right she'd been, and how close I'd come to never seeing her again. It all started on a muggy Tuesday evening outside of Baton Rouge. I'd been on the road for 14 hours straight, hauling a load of auto parts from Detroit to Houston. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, but I barely noticed. My eyes were heavy, my back aching from hours in the driver's seat. I knew I needed to find a place to pull over soon or risk falling asleep at the wheel. That's when I saw him, a lone figure on the side of the road, thumb outstretched. He was a scruffy-looking guy, maybe mid-30s, with a worn backpack slung over one shoulder. Under normal circumstances, I wouldn't have given him a second glance, but something about the desperation in his stance made me slow down. I pulled over, the air brakes hissing as the rig came to a stop. The man jogged up, a look of relief washing over his face. "Thanks, man," he said, his voice gravelly. "I've been out here for hours." I sized him up through the passenger window. He didn't look dangerous, just tired and a little rough around the edges. Against my better judgment, I popped the lock. "Where you headed?" I asked as he climbed in. "Houston," he replied, settling into the seat. "Name's Jack." I nodded, putting the truck in gear. "Mike, I'm heading that way myself. You're in luck." As we pulled back onto the highway, I couldn't shake a nagging feeling in my gut. But I chalked it up to fatigue and too much truck stop coffee. Besides, I reasoned, having someone to talk to might help keep me awake for the last leg of my journey. At first, Jack was the perfect passenger. He was quiet when I needed to focus on the road, but happy to chat during the long, straight stretches. We swapped stories about life on the road. He claimed to be a freelance photographer, always chasing the next great shot. "So what brings you to Houston?" I asked, a few hours into our drive. Jack's eyes flickered to the side mirror before answering. "Got a job lined up, fashion shoot for some up-and-coming designer." I nodded, but something about his answer felt off. His body had tensed up, almost imperceptibly. If I hadn't spent years reading people in my rearview mirror, I might have missed it. The miles rolled by, and I found myself growing more and more uneasy. Jack's questions were starting to feel less like casual conversation and more like interrogation. He was particularly interested in my route, my schedule, the contents of my trailer. "Just curious about the life," he'd say with a disarming smile whenever I hesitated to answer. Always thought about getting into trucking myself. By the time we crossed into Texas, alarm bells were ringing in my head. I needed to get this guy out of my cab, but we were in the middle of nowhere. The last thing I wanted was to spook him if he really was up to something. That's when fate, luck, or maybe divine intervention stepped in. A highway patrol car pulled up alongside us, lights flashing. The officer gestured for me to pull over. My heart was pounding as I eased the rig onto the shoulder. Next to me, Jack had gone very still, his eyes fixed on the approaching officer. "Evening, gentlemen," the cop said, shining his flashlight into the cab. "Everything all right here? We got a report of a suspicious vehicle matching your description." Before I could respond, Jack made his move. In one fluid motion, he pulled a gun from his waistband and pointed it at my head. "Drive," he snarled, all pretense of friendliness gone. Time seemed to slow down. I saw the officer's hand move to his holster, saw Jack's finger tighten on the trigger. In that split second, I made a decision that would haunt my nightmares for months to come. I threw the truck into gear and floored it. The sudden acceleration caught Jack off guard. He stumbled, the gun wavering. Behind us, I heard the officer shouting, the squeal of tires as he ran back to his cruiser. "What the hell are you doing?" Jack yelled, struggling to regain his balance. "Saving both our lives," I growled, hands white-knuckled on the wheel. "You shoot that gun, we're both dead." For a moment, I thought he might do it anyway, but then I heard the clatter of the gun hitting the floor, followed by a string of curses. "You idiot!" Jack spat. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" I didn't respond, every ounce of my concentration focused on the road ahead. In my mirrors, I could see the patrol car gaining on us, sirens wailing. More would be on the way. There was no way we were outrunning them, not in a fully loaded semi. Jack must have realized it too. He was rooting around in his backpack, muttering to himself. I caught glimpses of papers, a laptop, what looked like a fake ID. "Pull over," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's over, man." He laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "It's never over. You have no idea what you've stumbled into, trucker, no idea at all." Something in his tone sent a chill down my spine. This was more than just a random criminal. Whatever I'd gotten mixed up in, it was big. Ahead, I saw a roadblock forming, a line of patrol cars, lights flashing. There was nowhere left to go. As I began to slow the truck, Jack made one last desperate move. He lunged for the steering wheel, trying to force us off the road. We struggled for control, the rig swerving dangerously across the highway. In the chaos, I heard a loud pop. At first, I thought it was a gunshot, but then the truck began to slow, listing to one side. One of the tires had blown. The next few minutes were a blur of screeching metal and shouted commands. Somehow I managed to bring the truck to a stop without jackknifing. Before I could even catch my breath, the cab was swarming with officers, guns drawn. They pulled Jack out first, forcing him to the ground. As they cuffed him, I caught a glimpse of his face. The desperation was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating look that chilled me to the bone. An hour later, I sat in the back of an ambulance, a shock blanket draped over my shoulders. An FBI agent, they'd shown up shortly after we'd stopped, was taking my statement. "You're lucky to be alive, Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice grave. "The man you knew as Jack is actually Samuel Reeves, a high-ranking member of an international drug cartel. We've been tracking him for months." I nodded, still struggling to process everything that had happened. What was he doing in my truck?" The agent hesitated, sharing a look with her partner. "We believe he was using unsuspecting truckers to move product across state lines. Your route, your cargo, it was all perfect cover. The implications hit me like a physical blow. How many times had I unknowingly transported illegal drugs? How long had this been going on?" "We'll need you to come in for a more detailed statement," the agent continued. "And I'm afraid your truck will need to be impounded as evidence." I barely heard her. My mind was reeling, replaying every moment of the past few hours, searching for clues I might have missed. As dawn broke over the Texas highway, casting long shadows across the asphalt, I realized my life would never be the same. The open road, once a symbol of freedom, now felt treacherous and unpredictable. I watched as they loaded Jack Samuel into a heavily armored transport vehicle. Just before the doors closed, our eyes met. He smiled, a small, knowing smile that sent a shiver down my spine. In that moment, I knew this wasn't over. Whatever game he was playing, whatever web he'd tried to entangle me in, it was far from finished. And as I sat there, surrounded by the controlled chaos of the crime scene, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a much larger, much more dangerous story. One thing was certain: I'd never pick up another hitchhiker again. Some rides, it turns out, come with a price too high to pay. Story 4. The acrid smell of burning rubber filled my nostrils as I fought to keep my rig from careening off the mountain pass. My hands, slick with sweat, gripped the wheel so tight my knuckles had turned white. The speedometer was creeping up, 60, 70, 80 miles per hour. No matter how hard I stomped on the brake pedal, the 18-wheeler wouldn't slow down. As the next hairpin turn loomed ahead, a sickening realization hit me. This wasn't an accident. Someone wanted me dead. It had all started as a routine haul, or so I thought. I'd been driving trucks for over 2 decades, and the route from Seattle to Denver was one I could practically do with my eyes closed. But looking back, there were signs that something was off right from the get-go. The day began like any other. I arrived at the depot just as the sun was peeking over the horizon, casting long shadows across the parking lot. As I approached my rig, I noticed a guy I didn't recognize fiddling with something under the hood. "Hey," I called out, quickening my pace. "What do you think you're doing?" The man's head snapped up, his eyes wide with surprise. He was young, probably in his early 20s, with a scraggly beard and a worn trucker cap pulled low over his eyes. "Just checking the oil," he stammered, quickly slamming the hood shut. "New mechanic. Boss asked me to give her a once-over before you headed out." Something about his explanation didn't sit right with me, but I was already running late. I made a mental note to talk to dispatch about it later and climbed into the cab. The first few hours on the road were uneventful. I cruised down I-90, the familiar landscape of eastern Washington rolling by. The radio kept me company, a mix of classic rock and trucker talk shows. But as I crossed into Idaho, things started to feel off. It was subtle at first. The steering felt a little loose, the engine's pitch slightly higher than usual. Nothing major, just enough to tickle that sixth sense you develop after years on the road. I chalked it up to paranoia, my mind playing tricks after too many hours behind the wheel. By the time I hit Montana, there was no denying something was wrong. The brake pedal felt spongy under my foot, and the rig was pulling hard to the right. I radioed into dispatch, letting them know I was going to pull over at the next rest stop to check things out. That's when all hell broke loose. As I was navigating a particularly steep stretch of mountain road, I heard a loud pop, followed by a hiss. The steering wheel suddenly became almost impossible to turn. I fought to keep the truck in its lane, my heart pounding in my chest. I reached for the radio, intending to call for help, but found nothing but static. Someone had cut the wires. That's when the reality of my situation hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't a mechanical failure. This was sabotage. My mind raced, trying to figure out who would want me dead. I was just a simple trucker, not mixed up in anything illegal or dangerous. Or was I? What exactly was I hauling in that sealed container? There was no time to dwell on it. The next turn was coming up fast, and I was rapidly running out of options. The guardrail to my right offered a thin illusion of safety, but beyond it was a sheer drop of several hundred feet. To my left, the mountain face loomed, solid and unforgiving. In that moment, time seemed to slow down. I could see everything with crystal clarity. The beads of sweat on my forehead, the trembling of my hands on the wheel, the blur of green as trees whipped past the window. I thought of my wife, my kids, the grandchild I was supposed to meet next month. Was this how it was going to end? No, not if I had anything to say about it. With a surge of adrenaline, I wrenched the wheel to the left, aiming straight for the mountain face. It was a desperate move, but it was my only shot. Better to crash into solid rock than plummet off the side of the mountain. The impact was tremendous. Metal screamed as the front of the rig crumpled against the rocky outcropping. My body was thrown forward, then snapped back by the seatbelt. Pain exploded in my chest and my vision swam, but I was alive. For a moment, all I could hear was the ticking of cooling metal and my own ragged breathing. Then slowly, other sounds filtered in. The hiss of steam escaping from the battered engine, the distant wail of sirens, and footsteps. Through the cracked windshield, I saw a figure approaching. It was the guy from the depot, the one who'd been messing with my rig. Gone was the nervous demeanor. Now he moved with purpose, a cold determination in his eyes. Panic surged through me. I fumbled with my seatbelt, wincing at the pain in my ribs. Probably broken, but that was the least of my worries right now. I had to get out of there. Just as the man reached the driver's side door, a spotlight suddenly illuminated the scene. A voice boomed out over a loudspeaker. "This is the Montana Highway Patrol. Step away from the vehicle and put your hands where we can see them." The saboteur's head whipped around, his face a mask of fury and frustration. For a second, I thought he might try to finish the job anyway. But then his shoulders slumped in defeat. As the police swarmed the scene, he was quickly subdued and cuffed. The next few hours passed in a blur. Paramedics checked me over, cops took my statement, and a tow truck arrived to deal with the mangled remains of my rig. It wasn't until I was sitting in the back of an ambulance, an oxygen mask on my face and an IV in my arm, that the full weight of what had happened hit me. A detective approached, his face grim. "Mr. Johnson, I'm Detective Reeves. Think you're up for a few questions, I nodded weakly, and he climbed into the ambulance, settling onto the bench across from me. "The man we apprehended is Jamie Cortez," Reeves began, pulling out a notepad. "Ring any bells?" I shook my head. The name meant nothing to me. "Cortez is a low-level enforcer for the Salazar cartel," Reeves continued. "We've been tracking him for months, but what we can't figure out is why he was targeting you." My mind spun. A cartel? What the hell had I gotten mixed up in? Seeing my confusion, Reeves leaned in closer. "Mr. Johnson, I need you to think carefully. Has anything unusual happened on your routes lately? Any unscheduled stops, unexpected cargo?" As he spoke, a memory surfaced. About a month ago, I'd been asked to take on an extra container at the last minute. The paperwork had all seemed in order, but the whole thing had been rushed. At the time, I'd been grateful for the extra pay. Now I felt sick to my stomach. "There was a container," I said slowly, my voice muffled by the oxygen mask. "Last month. It was a last-minute addition to my usual haul." Reeves nodded, scribbling in his notepad. "We'll need to check the records, but my guess is the cartel was using you as an unwitting mule. When we started getting too close, they decided to tie up loose ends. The implication hit me like a physical blow. I'd been transporting drugs, unknowingly, sure. But that didn't change the fact that I'd played a part in their operation." "What happens now?" I asked, suddenly feeling very tired. Reeves' expression softened slightly. "Now you rest and recover. We'll need a full statement when you're up to it, and you'll probably have to testify if this goes to trial. But you're the victim here, Mr. Johnson. We'll make sure you're protected." As the ambulance doors closed and we began the journey to the hospital, I stared out at the mountain road that had almost claimed my life. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. It was beautiful, in a way that only nearly dying can make you appreciate. I thought about all the miles I'd driven, all the sunsets I'd seen from behind the wheel. I'd always loved the freedom of the open road, the simple pleasure of being my own boss out here on the highway. But now that same road felt treacherous, full of hidden dangers. As we wound our way down the mountain, I made a decision. Once this was all over, once the cartel was dealt with and the courts had had their say, I was done with trucking. It was time to hang up my keys, to find a safer way to make a living. But first, I had a story to tell. A story of sabotage, survival, and a brush with an underworld I never knew existed. And as the adrenaline faded and the pain meds kicked in, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a much larger, much more dangerous tale. The open road, it turns out, had one last adventure in store for me, and this time I'd make damn sure I knew exactly what I was hauling. Story 5. The photo trembled in my hands, my daughter's smiling face blurred by tears I refused to let fall. Across the truck stop parking lot, I could see them waiting. 2 men in a black SUV, their eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses, even in the fading twilight. I had a choice to make, and both options led straight to hell. It had all started 3 days ago on what should have been a routine run from Miami to Atlanta. I'd been driving trucks for nearly 2 decades, and this route was as familiar to me as the back of my hand. Little did I know this trip would change my life forever. The day began like any other. I woke before dawn, kissed my sleeping wife goodbye, and headed to the depot. As I approached my rig, I noticed a package sitting on the driver's seat. Probably some last-minute paperwork, I thought. I couldn't have been more wrong. Inside the envelope was a burner phone and a photo of my family. My wife tending to her garden, our teenage daughter walking home from school. The timestamp showed it had been taken yesterday. A chill ran down my spine as I pulled out a handwritten note. "Drive the route, don't deviate, don't call the cops, we're watching. Your family's life depends on it." My hands shook as I stared at the note, my mind racing. This had to be some kind of sick joke, right? But deep down I knew it wasn't. The level of detail, the clear threat, this was real. The burner phone buzzed, making me jump. A text message appeared. "Get driving. Now." Heart pounding, I climbed into the cab and started the engine. What choice did I have? As I pulled out of the depot, my eyes darted constantly to the mirrors, searching for any sign of who might be watching me. The first few hours on the road were a nightmare of paranoia and fear. Every car that stayed behind me too long, every police cruiser I passed, were they involved? Were they watching? The burner phone remained silent, offering no clues. It wasn't until I crossed into Georgia that I received another message. Exit 27, truck stop. Wait for further instructions. My mouth went dry. This was it. Whatever they wanted me to do, whatever cargo they were going to force me to carry, it was about to happen. The truck stop was busy, a typical mix of long-haul truckers and vacationing families. I parked in the far corner of the lot, away from prying eyes. As soon as I cut the engine, the burner phone rang. "Listen carefully," a gravelly voice said without preamble. "In 10 minutes, a man will approach your truck. He'll give you a package. You'll put it in your cab and continue on your route. Deliver it to the address we'll send you in Atlanta. Do this and your family lives. Fail and, well, you've seen what we can do." The line went dead before I could respond. My mind raced, trying to find a way out of this nightmare. Could I risk calling the police? But what if they were watching, like they claimed? The image of my daughter's smiling face flashed in my mind. I couldn't take that risk. True to their word, 10 minutes later, a man approached my truck. He was nondescript, average height, brown hair, the kind of face you'd forget as soon as you looked away. Without a word, he handed me a small, heavy package wrapped in brown paper. As soon as my fingers closed around it, I knew what it was. The weight, the shape, it could only be drugs. My stomach churned. In all my years on the road, I'd prided myself on running a clean operation. Now, with a single package, I was about to throw all that away. The next few hours were the longest of my life. Every mile marker, every highway patrol car sent my heart racing. The package sat on the passenger seat, impossible to ignore. I was hyper-aware of every bump in the road, every turn. What if the package broke open? What if I got pulled over for a routine check? As I approached Atlanta, the burner phone buzzed again. An address appeared on the screen, followed by another message. "Remember, we're watching. One wrong move, and your family pays the price." The address led me to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. As I pulled up, I saw them. 2 men leaning against a black SUV, waiting. This was it. The moment of truth. With shaking hands, I grabbed the package and climbed down from the cab. Every step towards them felt like walking to my own execution. "You're late!" one of them growled as I approached. "Traffic," I mumbled, holding out the package. The second man snatched it from my hands, quickly tearing open the wrapping. He pulled out a brick of white powder, nodding in satisfaction. "Looks like it's all here," he said to his partner. "Guess your family gets to live another day, driver." Relief washed over me, so intense it made my knees weak. It was over. I'd done what they asked. My family was safe. But as I turned to leave, the first man's voice stopped me cold. "Not so fast. You did good, driver. So good, in fact, that we've got another job for you." My blood ran cold. "What? No, I did what you asked. We're done here." The man's laugh was devoid of humor. "You don't get it, do you? You're in this now. You work for us." "And if I refuse?" I asked, already knowing the answer. In response, he pulled out his phone, showing me a live feed. My heart stopped. It was my house, my wife visible through the kitchen window, oblivious to the danger she was in. "This isn't a one-time deal," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You're our mule now. You'll drive when we tell you, where we tell you. And if you ever think about going to the cops..." He let the threat hang in the air, unfinished but crystal clear. As the reality of my situation sank in, I felt something inside me break. In trying to protect my family, I'd condemned us all to a life of fear and crime. There was no way out, or was there? As I climbed back into my rig, my mind raced. There had to be a solution, some way to protect my family and get us out of this mess. But every scenario I played out in my head ended in disaster. Go to the police? My family would be dead before I finished giving my statement. Try to run? Where could we go that these people couldn't find us? For the next month, I lived a double life. To the outside world, I was still just a long-haul trucker, nothing out of the ordinary. But every other run, I'd receive a message on that cursed burner phone. Another package. Another drop. Another piece of my soul chipped away. I tried to hide it from my family, but they knew something was wrong. The bags under my eyes grew darker, my temper shorter. My daughter asked why I jumped every time my phone buzzed. My wife's concerned looks cut deeper than any knife. It was during a rare weekend at home that I made my decision. We were sitting around the dinner table, my wife and daughter chatting about some school project, when it hit me. This moment, this simple family dinner, this was what I was fighting for, and I'd do anything to protect it. The next day I made 2 calls. The first was to an old Army buddy who'd gone into private security. The second was to a lawyer friend who owed me a favor. It was time to fight back. Over the next week, we put together a plan. It was risky, dangerous even, but it was the only way I could see to get my family out of this mess. The next time I got a call for a run, I was ready. As I pulled into the truck stop where I was supposed to pick up the package, I saw them waiting, the 2 men from the SUV. But this time I wasn't alone. As I stepped out of my truck, I saw confusion flicker across their faces. They were expecting a broken man, beaten down by fear and guilt. Instead, they got me, standing tall, a glint of defiance in my eye. "It's over," I said, my voice steady. "I'm done." One of them reached for his gun, but before he could draw, the parking lot erupted into chaos. FBI agents seemed to materialize out of thin air, weapons drawn. My Army buddies' team cut off any escape routes. In a matter of minutes, it was over. The men were in cuffs, their operation blown wide open. As an agent led me away to take my statement, I caught a glimpse of a familiar face, my lawyer friend, nodding in satisfaction. The next few months were a whirlwind of debriefings, court appearances, and sleepless nights. But through it all, my family stood by me. We entered witness protection, starting a new life far from the open road I'd called home for so long. It wasn't easy. There were nightmares, panic attacks, moments when the guilt threatened to overwhelm me. But slowly, day by day, we began to heal. Now, as I sit on the porch of our new home, watching my daughter tend to the garden with my wife, I know I made the right choice. The open road might have been my life, but my family, they're my world. And I'd face down 1,000 criminals to keep them safe. The trucking life is behind me now, but the lessons I learned will stay with me forever. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is ask for help. And sometimes the most important cargo isn't in your trailer, it's waiting for you at home. Story 6. The crunch of metal and shattering glass jolted me awake, my body tensing as I braced for an impact that never came. My rig shuddered to a halt, the acrid smell of burnt rubber filling my nostrils. Through the cracked windshield, I saw a car overturned in front of me, its wheels still spinning lazily in the air. As I fumbled for my phone to call 911, I had no idea that I was about to become the victim of an elaborate heist that would change my life forever. It had started as just another night on the road. I'd been hauling a load of high-end electronics from Chicago to Denver, a route I'd driven dozens of times before. The highway stretched out before me, a ribbon of black cutting through the vast emptiness of the Midwest. The clock on my dashboard read 2:37 a.m., and the only company I had was the low hum of my engine and the occasional flicker of headlights from a passing car. I'd been fighting off sleep for the last hour, my eyelids growing heavier with each passing mile. The thermos of coffee at my side had long since gone cold, and I was seriously considering pulling over at the next rest stop for a quick nap. That's when I saw it. A pair of headlights in my rearview mirror approaching fast. Before I could react, the car shot past me, swerving erratically. My heart leapt into my throat as I watched it fishtail, then spin out of control. Time seemed to slow down as the car flipped once, twice, before coming to rest on its roof directly in my path. I slammed on the brakes, the trailer behind me jackknifing as I fought to keep control. The world outside became a blur of motion and screeching tires. When we finally skidded to a stop, mere feet from the overturned car, I was shaking so hard I could barely unbuckle my seatbelt. "Hello? Is anyone hurt?" I called out as I climbed down from the cab, my voice sounding strange and distant in my own ears. The night was eerily quiet, broken only by the tick-tick-tick of cooling metal and the distant hoot of an owl. As I approached the wrecked car, a feeling of dread settled in my stomach. Something wasn't right. The car's windows were tinted so dark I couldn't see inside, and there was no sign of any debris on the road, no skid marks, no broken glass, nothing to indicate a real accident had occurred. That's when I heard it, the soft crunch of gravel behind me. I turned, my heart pounding, to find myself face to face with a man wearing a ski mask and holding a gun. "Don't move," he said, his voice low and threatening. "Hands where I can see them." I froze, my mind racing. This couldn't be happening. It had to be a nightmare, some hallucination brought on by too many hours on the road. But the cold metal of the gun pressed against my temple felt all too real. 2 more men emerged from the shadows, also masked. While one kept his gun trained on me, the others moved towards my truck. "The keys," the first man demanded. Now, with trembling hands, I fished the keys from my pocket and handed them over. As one of the men climbed into the cab, the reality of the situation hit me like a physical blow. They were after my cargo, over $1 million worth of electronics, and I was powerless to stop them. "Please," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I've got a family, a little girl. This job is all I have." The man with the gun laughed, a harsh, humorless sound that sent chills down my spine. "Should have thought of that before you decided to haul such valuable cargo, friend. Now on your knees." I did as I was told, the gravel digging into my legs as I knelt on the side of the road. I could hear the others working quickly, transferring the cargo from my trailer to another vehicle I hadn't noticed before, a large van parked just out of sight around a bend. "What are you going to do with me?" I asked, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. The man shrugged. "That depends on you. Play nice, and maybe you'll live to see that little girl of yours again." As he spoke, one of the other men approached, carrying a length of rope. My heart sank. They were going to tie me up and leave me here miles from anywhere with no way to call for help. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. Just as they were about to bind my hands, a pair of headlights appeared on the horizon. Another truck was approaching. The men froze, caught off guard by this unexpected development. "Shit," the leader hissed. "We're out of time. Forget him. Let's go." They scrambled towards their van, leaving me kneeling on the roadside, stunned by this sudden turn of events. As the sound of their engine faded into the distance, I slowly got to my feet, my legs shaking so badly I could barely stand. The approaching truck slowed as it neared the scene, its driver no doubt confused by the sight of my jackknifed rig and the overturned car. As it pulled to a stop, I saw the driver reach for his radio, probably calling for help. The next few hours passed in a blur. Highway patrol arrived, followed by detectives and a forensics team. I told my story over and over, each retelling making it feel more surreal. How could this have happened? How had I fallen for such an obvious trap? As dawn broke, casting a pale light over the scene, I sat in the back of an ambulance, a shock blanket draped over my shoulders. A detective approached, his face grim. "Mr. Johnson," he said, taking a seat next to me. "I'm afraid I have some bad news." My heart sank. What now? "We've been in touch with the shipping company," he continued. "It seems the cargo you were carrying wasn't just electronics. Hidden among the laptops and tablets was a substantial amount of cocaine, street value of about $5 million. I felt the blood drain from my face. That's impossible. I had no idea, I swear, I didn't know." The detective held up a hand. "We believe you, Mr. Johnson. But the fact remains, you were unknowingly transporting drugs across state lines. And the people who staged this accident, they knew exactly what they were after." My mind reeled, trying to process this information. All those years on the road, all those cargo manifests I'd signed without a second thought. Had I been a drug mule all along? "What happens now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The detective sighed. "Well, that's up to you. We're dealing with a sophisticated drug trafficking operation here. They clearly have inside information, connections in the shipping industry. We could use your help to bring them down." I stared at him, disbelief warring with a growing sense of anger. "You want me to help you? After what I've just been through?" "I know it's a lot to ask," he said, his tone softening. "But think about it. How many other truckers out there are unknowingly hauling drugs? How many more might fall victim to schemes like this? You could help us put a stop to it." As the sun rose higher in the sky, painting the world in shades of gold and pink, I found myself at a crossroads. On one hand, I could walk away from all this, find a new job, try to forget this night ever happened. But could I really go back to my normal life, knowing what I knew now? On the other hand, helping the police meant putting myself and my family at risk. These weren't small-time crooks. They were part of a larger, more dangerous organization. If they found out I was cooperating with law enforcement, the detective must have sensed my internal struggle. "You don't have to decide right now," he said, handing me his card. "Take some time, talk it over with your family. But Mr. Johnson, whatever you decide, watch your back. These people know who you are now." As I watched him walk away, I felt the weight of the world settling on my shoulders. In the span of a few hours, my life had been turned upside down. The open road, once a symbol of freedom, now felt fraught with hidden dangers. I thought about my daughter, her innocent smile flashing in my mind. I thought about all the other drivers out there, unaware of the risks they were taking with every load. And I thought about the men who had staged this accident, who had held a gun to my head and laughed at my fear. In that moment, I made my decision. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number on the detective's card. "Detective, it's Johnson. I'm in. Whatever you need me to do, I'll do it. It's time we put a stop to this, once and for all." As I hung up, I felt a mix of fear and determination wash over me. The road ahead would be dangerous, filled with risks I couldn't even imagine. But for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a glimmer of hope. The open highway stretched out before me, no longer just a path from point A to point B, but a battleground in a war I never knew was being fought. And I was ready to fight back. Story 7. They say curiosity killed the cat. In my case, it nearly killed the trucker. One split-second decision, one wrong turn, and suddenly I was in way over my head. But let me start from the beginning. It was a crisp autumn night, the kind where the air feels sharp in your lungs and the stars seem to shine a little brighter. I'd been on the road for 14 hours straight, hauling a load of electronics from Chicago to Pittsburgh. The caffeine from my last truck stop coffee was wearing off, and my eyelids felt heavier with each passing mile. I remember checking my GPS, just another hour to go. The thought of a hot shower and a soft bed at the motel near my drop-off point kept me going. That's when I saw it. A faint glow off in the distance, somewhere deep in the woods off to my right. Now I've been driving these roads for 20 years, and I know every diner, gas station, and rest stop along the way. But this light, this was new. And in my caffeine-deprived state, my curiosity got the better of me. I spotted a dirt road coming up, and without really thinking it through, I flicked on my turn signal. The truck's headlights cut through the darkness as I navigated the narrow path, branches scraping against the sides of my rig like fingernails on a chalkboard. As I got closer, the glow resolved itself into what looked like headlights, 3 pairs of them arranged in a semicircle. I killed my own lights and engine, letting momentum carry me the last few yards. Something in my gut told me to be quiet, to be invisible. That's when I heard the voices. "You thought you could skim off the top and we wouldn't notice, Tommy." The voice was deep, gravelly, like someone who'd smoked too many cigars in smoky back rooms. I crept out of my cab, my boots crunching softly on the gravel. I could see them now, 5 men standing in the glare of the headlights. 4 of them wore suits that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage. The 5th guy, though, he was on his knees, and even from this distance I could see he was shaking. "Please, Mr. Caruso," the kneeling man pleaded, his voice cracking. "It was just a mistake in the books. I can fix it, I swear. I should have left right then. Should have climbed back in my rig and hightailed it out of there, pretending I'd never seen a thing. But my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, hidden behind a thick oak tree, watching the scene unfold like some twisted theater play." The man called Caruso stepped forward, his silhouette blocking out one of the headlights. "Tommy, Tommy, Tommy," he said, clucking his tongue like a disappointed school teacher. "You know how this works. We gave you a chance when no one else would. Took you in, made you family, and this is how you repay us." I watched as Caruso reached into his jacket. The moonlight glinted off something metallic, and my heart nearly stopped. A gun. This wasn't just some business meeting gone wrong. This was an execution. Time seemed to slow down. I saw Tommy's eyes widen, saw his mouth open in a silent scream. I wanted to shout, to do something, anything to stop what was about to happen, but fear had paralyzed me, turning my bones to lead and my throat to sand. The gunshot cracked through the night like thunder echoing off the trees. Tommy's body crumpled to the ground, a marionette with its strings cut. And me? I stumbled backward, my foot catching on a root. I went down hard, the back of my head smacking against my truck's fuel tank with a dull thunk. Stars exploded behind my eyes, and for a moment the world went dark. When my vision cleared, I realized with horror that I'd made noise, a lot of noise. What was that? One of the suited men was looking in my direction, squinting into the darkness. Probably just a deer, another replied. This time of night, woods are full of them. Caruso wasn't convinced. Check it out, he ordered. We can't afford any loose ends. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure they could hear it. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the throbbing in my skull, and dove into the cab of my truck. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life just as I heard shouting behind me. I threw the truck into reverse, not even bothering to check my mirrors. The crunch of metal told me I'd hit one of their cars, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out of there. Tires spinning in the loose dirt, I managed to turn the rig around. That's when the first bullet hit, shattering my driver's side mirror. I ducked instinctively, my foot pressing the accelerator to the floor. The truck burst out onto the main road, tires squealing as I fought to keep control. In my rear view, I could see headlights gaining on me. My mind was racing faster than my truck. What do I do? Where do I go? I couldn't lead them to the motel, couldn't risk putting other people in danger. I remembered an old truck stop about 20 miles up the road. It had gone out of business years ago, but the lot should still be there. Maybe I could lose them. Maybe I could hide. The next 20 minutes were the longest of my life. Every set of headlights I saw made my heart jump. Every curve in the road had me gripping the wheel tighter, sure that this would be where they caught up, where my luck would run out. But somehow, miraculously, I made it to the old truck stop. I killed my lights as I pulled in, praying that the overgrown weeds and abandoned buildings would provide enough cover. For hours I sat there in the dark, jumping at every sound. Dawn was just starting to break when I finally worked up the courage to move. My hands were cramped from gripping the steering wheel, and my shirt was soaked through with sweat. I knew I couldn't go to the police. Men like Caruso, they had connections everywhere. Who could I trust? As the sun climbed higher in the sky, I made a decision. I couldn't go back to my old life. It wasn't safe, for me or for anyone I cared about. I drove to the nearest Western Union and emptied my bank account. Then I pointed my truck west and just drove. I didn't stop until I hit the Pacific Ocean. That was 3 years ago. I've got a new name now, a new life driving local routes in a small Oregon town. But I still see Tommy's face in my dreams. Still hear that gunshot echoing through the trees. And every time I pass a dirt road at night, my heart races, wondering what secrets lie hidden in the darkness. They say curiosity killed the cat. Me? I'm still alive. But sometimes on those long, quiet nights, I wonder if that's really a blessing or a curse. Story 8. The roar of engines should have been my first warning. But out here in the vastness of the Nevada desert, sound plays tricks on you. By the time I realized the danger, it was already too late. My name's Jack, and I've been hauling freight across the American Southwest for the better part of 2 decades. I've seen my share of weird stuff out on these lonely stretches of asphalt, but nothing could have prepared me for that night on Highway 50, what folks around here call the loneliest road in America. It was just past midnight, and I was about 4 hours out from Reno. The moon hung low and heavy in the sky, casting long shadows across the empty landscape. My radio had fizzled out to static an hour back, so it was just me and the hum of my rig's engine for company. I remember thinking about how I'd kill for a hot cup of coffee when I first spotted them in my rear view, a cluster of headlights way off in the distance. Nothing too unusual about that, except they were moving fast, real fast. At first, I didn't think much of it. Probably just some tourists in a hurry to hit the casinos in Reno, I figured. But as the minutes ticked by and those lights kept gaining, a knot started forming in the pit of my stomach. That's when I heard it. A sound like rolling thunder, growing louder by the second. But there wasn't a cloud in the sky. No, this thunder had an engine behind it, or rather dozens of engines. I leaned forward, squinting at my side mirror. The headlights had resolved into a swarm, weaving back and forth across the highway like angry hornets. Motorcycles, at least 30 of them, maybe more. Now, I've got nothing against bikers. Hell, I've got a Harley in my garage back home that I take out on weekends. But something about this group set off every alarm bell in my head. They were moving with a purpose, and somehow I knew that purpose involved me. I eased my foot down on the accelerator, pushing my rig up to 75, then 80. But it was no use. These bikes were built for speed, and my 18-wheeler was built for hauling. They were on me before I could even think about radioing for help. The first bike pulled alongside my cab, and I got my first good look at them. The rider's face was hidden behind a matte black helmet, but the jacket he wore told me everything I needed to know. Patches covered every inch of the leather, but one stood out, a grinning skull wearing a Native American headdress. The painted skulls. I'd heard whispers about them at truck stops and dingy bars. They weren't just some weekend warrior biker club. These guys were the real deal, organized crime on two wheels. The biker turned his head towards me, and even though I couldn't see his eyes, I felt the weight of his stare. He raised a gloved hand, gesturing for me to pull over. Fat chance of that happening. I tightened my grip on the wheel and started looking for options. There was nothing but empty desert on either side of the highway. No turnoffs, no towns, not even a gas station for miles. I was on my own. That's when things went from bad to worse. I heard a sharp crack, and suddenly my passenger side mirror exploded into a shower of glass and plastic. These bastards were shooting at me. Adrenaline surged through my system. I yanked the wheel hard to the right, trying to force the bikes away. It worked for a moment. The swarm scattered, falling back behind my trailer. But it was a short-lived victory. They came at me again, this time from both sides. I heard more gunshots, the ping of bullets hitting metal. I ducked low in my seat, trying to make myself as small a target as possible while still keeping the truck on the road. That's when I saw it, a flicker of movement on my left. One of the bikers had pulled up right next to my door. In his hand was something that looked like a small propane tank with wires sticking out of it. Even in the chaos of the moment, I knew what it was, an IED, a freaking bomb. Time seemed to slow down. I watched, helpless, as the biker pulled the pin and tossed the device. It sailed through the air in a lazy arc, heading straight for my fuel tank. In that split second, training and instinct took over. I stomped on the brakes with everything I had, sending my rig into a screeching skid. The bomb hit the asphalt just in front of my back wheels and exploded. The blast rocked my whole world. I felt the back end of the truck lift off the ground, tilting at a sickening angle. For a heart-stopping moment, I was sure I was going to flip. But then, by some miracle, the wheels slammed back down onto the pavement. My ears were ringing and smoke was pouring from somewhere behind me, but I was still moving, still alive. The blast had scattered the bikers, buying me a few precious seconds. I didn't waste them. I grabbed my CB radio and started shouting into it, praying that someone, anyone, was out there listening. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Jackrabbit hauling east on Highway 50. I'm under attack by a motorcycle gang. I need help." Static was my only answer. The bikers were regrouping, coming at me again. I was running out of options and out of road. That's when I remembered. There was an old scenic overlook coming up just a few miles ahead. It wasn't much, but it was my only shot. I pushed my poor battered truck to its limits, coaxing every last bit of speed out of the engine. The bikers were right on my tail. So close I could hear the roar of their engines over the wind rushing past my broken window. The overlook appeared ahead. A small turnout carved into the side of a hill. I didn't hesitate. I cranked the wheel hard, sending my rig careening onto the gravel. The sudden turn caught the bikers off guard. I heard the screech of tires, the crunch of metal on metal as some of them collided. My truck skidded to a stop at the edge of the overlook, wheels just inches from a steep drop-off. I killed the engine and sat there for a moment, heart pounding, ears straining for any sound of pursuit. Nothing. Just the tick of my cooling engine and the whisper of the desert wind. With shaking hands, I reached for my flashlight and unholstered the pistol I keep under my seat. I never thought I'd have to use it, but I was damn glad to have it now. I eased out of the cab, my boots crunching on gravel. The night was eerily silent. Where had they gone? Surely they wouldn't just give up, not after all that. That's when I saw it, a faint glow coming from my trailer. With my heart in my throat, I crept around to the back. The padlock on the doors had been shot clean off. I yanked the doors open, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. And there, nestled among the crates of auto parts I was supposed to be delivering, was a sight that made my blood run cold. People, at least a dozen of them, men and women, bound and gagged. Their eyes wide with terror and relief as they saw me. This whole attack, it had never been about me at all. I was just the unlucky son of a bitch who happened to be hauling the cargo they wanted to intercept. I didn't have time to process it all. In the distance, I could hear engines revving. The painted skulls weren't done with me yet. As I started cutting the captives free, my mind was racing. How the hell was I going to get all these people out of here? My truck was damaged, probably wouldn't get far. We were sitting ducks. But as I helped the last person down from the trailer, I realized something. I wasn't alone anymore. And sometimes that makes all the difference. We worked fast, gathering rocks, loose boards, anything we could use as weapons. As the sound of motorcycles grew louder, we took up positions around the truck. Scared? Hell yeah, I was terrified. But there's a strength in numbers, in knowing you're fighting for something bigger than yourself. As the first headlights appeared on the road below, I gripped my makeshift weapon tighter. I didn't know how this was going to play out, but I did know one thing. This truck driver wasn't going down without a fight. The night was far from over, and dawn seemed a lifetime away. But standing there, surrounded by people I'd never met but was now ready to die for, I felt something I hadn't felt in years on these lonely highways. Hope. Story 9. They say every man has his price. I never thought I'd find out mine, but when you're staring down the barrel of a gun with your family's lives on the line, you'd be surprised what you're willing to do. My name's Mike, and for the past 15 years, I've been crisscrossing the country in my big rig, hauling everything from produce to furniture. It's not a glamorous life, but it's honest work. Or at least it was until that night in Chicago changed everything. It was a Tuesday, cold and damp, the kind of evening where the city lights blur into hazy halos through the mist. I just finished a long haul from Phoenix and was looking forward to a hot shower and a soft bed at the motel near the depot. That's when my phone buzzed with a text from dispatch. One more pickup before you clock out. 1255 West 15th Street. Ask for Vinny. I groaned. It wasn't unusual for last-minute jobs to come in, but I was beat. Still, overtime pay was overtime pay. I punched the address into my GPS and headed out. The warehouse was in a rundown industrial area, the kind of place where the streetlights flicker more often than they shine. As I pulled up, I noticed there weren't any signs, no company name, just a nondescript building with peeling paint and rusted metal doors. A stocky guy in a leather jacket was waiting for me. "You Vinny?" I called out as I climbed down from the cab. He nodded, eyes darting around like he was expecting someone else to show up. "Back it in," he grunted, jerking his thumb towards the loading dock. As I maneuvered the truck into position, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Maybe it was the way Vinny kept checking his phone, or how his hand never strayed far from the bulge under his jacket that I was pretty sure was a gun. It took less than 10 minutes for them to load up my trailer. 3 large crates, each about the size of a refrigerator. "What am I hauling?" I asked as Vinny handed me the paperwork. "You don't need to know," he said flatly. "Just get it to this address." He handed me a slip of paper with coordinates scribbled on it. Middle of nowhere in upstate New York. That's when I heard it. A thump from inside one of the crates. My blood ran cold. "What the hell was that?" Vinny's face hardened. In a flash, he had a gun pointed at my chest. "You heard nothing, understand? Now you're going to drive this load to those coordinates. You're going to dump it exactly where we tell you. And then you're going to forget this ever happened." I raised my hands slowly, heart pounding. "Look, man, I don't want any trouble. Whatever this is, I'm not—" The gun pressed against my forehead, cold and unyielding. "Let me make this real simple for you," Vinny snarled. "You do this job, you get paid 5 times your usual rate. You don't—" He pulled out his phone, showed me a photo that made my stomach lurch. My wife Annie picking up our daughter Lily from soccer practice. The photo couldn't have been more than a few hours old. "We know where they live," Vinny continued. "We know their routines, so you're going to do exactly what we say or they're going to disappear. Got it?" I nodded, numb with fear and shock. What choice did I have? The next few hours passed in a blur. I remembered climbing into my cab, hands shaking so bad I could barely turn the key. I remembered merging onto I-90 East, the Chicago skyline fading in my rearview mirror. And I remembered the silence, a silence so deep and oppressive it felt like it might crush me. Every few minutes I'd hear another thump from the trailer. Sometimes it was a single, dull sound. Other times a frantic series of knocks. Once I swear I heard a muffled scream. Each noise twisted my gut, but I kept driving. What else could I do? Sometime around dawn, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Exit 41, dirt road on the right, 2 miles in." I followed the instructions mechanically, turning off onto a narrow, overgrown path that my rig could barely navigate. The trees pressed in close on either side, branches scraping against the sides of the trailer like bony fingers. Finally, I reached a small clearing. 2 men were waiting for me, both armed. One of them, a tall guy with a scar running down his cheek, approached my window. "Back it up to the edge there," he instructed, pointing to where the clearing dropped off into a steep ravine. As I maneuvered the truck into position, I caught glimpses of the ravine in my side mirrors. It was deep, at least 100 feet, with a fast-moving river at the bottom. My stomach churned as I realized what they wanted me to do. Once the truck was in place, Scarface and his buddy went to work. They unlatched the trailer doors and started pushing the crates towards the edge. That's when I heard it again. Not just thumps this time, but muffled cries. Human cries. I couldn't take it anymore. I jumped out of the cab, my legs nearly buckling beneath me. "Stop!" I yelled. "There are people in there." Scarface turned to me, his expression cold. "Get back in the truck." "No," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. "I won't be part of this. Whatever you're paying me, it's not worth." The punch came out of nowhere, catching me square in the jaw. I tasted blood as I hit the ground. Scarface loomed over me, gun drawn. "Last chance," he growled. "Either you help us push these crates over or you're going in with them." I looked past him to the crates. One of them had shifted in the fall, its lid slightly ajar. Through the gap, I caught a glimpse of wide, terrified eyes. A woman, gagged and bound. In that moment, something inside me snapped. Maybe it was the thought of my own family, how easily it could be them in those crates. Maybe it was just the weight of my own conscience finally becoming too heavy to ignore. I surged to my feet, catching Scarface off guard. My fist connected with his nose, sending him stumbling backward. His gun clattered to the ground. What happened next was a blur of fists and desperation. I wasn't a fighter, never had been. But in that moment, I fought like my life depended on it. Because it did. Somehow, I ended up with Scarface's gun. His buddy was on the ground, clutching a bloody leg where I'd managed to clip him. And me, I was standing there, shaking, trying to wrap my head around what I'd just done. With trembling hands, I called 911, told them everything. Then I went to the crates and started prying them open. There were 9 people in total, men and women, some barely more than kids. All of them looked at me with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. "It's okay," I told them, even though nothing about this situation was okay. "Help is coming. You're safe now." As the sound of sirens grew in the distance, I sat down heavily on the damp forest floor. My phone buzzed, another text from that unknown number. Probably threats, maybe even photos of my family to remind me of what I stood to lose. I didn't read it. Instead, I turned off the phone and crushed it under my boot heel. The first police cars crested the hill, lights flashing. As the officers approached, weapons drawn, I raised my hand slowly. "My name is Mike Thornton," I called out. "I'm a truck driver, and I have one hell of a story to tell you." I didn't know what was going to happen next. Didn't know if my family was safe or if I'd ever drive a truck again. But as I watched the rescue workers helping the victims out of those crates, I knew one thing for certain. For the first time in what felt like forever, the weight of silence was gone. And whatever came next, I'd face it with a clear conscience. Sometimes that's all a man can ask for. Story 10. I've seen a lot of strange things in my 20 years on the road, but nothing could have prepared me for that night at Lose Gas and Go. They say being in the wrong place at the wrong time can change your life. Well, let me tell you, sometimes it can damn near end it. My name's Ray, and I drive an 18-wheeler for a living. It's not a glamorous job, but it pays the bills and keeps me moving. That's how I like it. Always on the go, never staying in one place long enough for the ghosts of my past to catch up. It was a Thursday night in late October when everything went sideways. I was hauling a load of electronics from Dallas to Chicago, fighting to keep my eyes open as I crossed the Missouri state line. The clock on my dash read 2:17 a.m., and my eyelids felt like they were made of lead. That's when I saw the sign, "Lose Gas and Go, last fuel for 100 miles." The gas gauge was hovering just above empty, and my stomach was growling something fierce. I figured I'd kill 2 birds with 1 stone, fill up the tank and grab a bite to eat. I pulled off the highway, my headlights cutting through the fog that had settled over the landscape like a shroud. Lou's was a tiny speck of light in the darkness, a rundown little place with flickering neon signs and a single pump that looked older than me. As I maneuvered my rig into the lot, I noticed there was only one other vehicle there, a sleek black sedan that looked way too fancy for a place like this. It was parked off to the side, engine running, tinted windows hiding whoever was inside. I didn't think much of it at the time. Should have known better. The bell above the door jingled as I walked in, and the smell of stale coffee and greasy food hit me like a wall. Behind the counter was an old guy with a beard that could have housed a family of squirrels. His name tag read, Lou. "Evening," I nodded, heading for the coffee pot. Lou grunted in response, his eyes never leaving the small TV perched on the counter. Some talking head was going on about an upcoming election, but I tuned it out. Politics was never my thing. I was pouring my coffee when the bell jingled again. Two men walked in, both wearing suits that probably cost more than I made in a month. The shorter one, a wiry guy with a face like a rat, made a beeline for the restroom. The other one, tall and built like a linebacker, walked up to the counter. "Pack of Marlboros," he said, his voice low and gravelly. Lou turned to grab the cigarettes, and that's when I saw it, the gun tucked into the waistband of the suit guy's pants. My hand froze mid-pour, coffee overflowing the cup and spilling onto my fingers. I barely felt the burn. The suit must have sensed me staring because he turned, fixing me with a look that could have frozen hell itself. I quickly averted my eyes, pretending to be real interested in the nutrition facts on my coffee cup. The bell jingled a third time. I looked up to see another man enter. He was older, maybe in his 60s, with silver hair and the kind of tan you only get from too much time on a golf course. He walked with the confidence of someone used to being in charge. The atmosphere in the store changed instantly. It was like all the air had been sucked out of the room. Suit guy's hand twitched towards his gun, and I saw Lou's eyes go wide with recognition. "Senator," Lou said, his voice barely above a whisper. The silver-haired man, the senator apparently, smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Hello, Lou. It's been a while." I stood there, frozen, coffee dripping from my forgotten cup. My instincts were screaming at me to get the hell out of there, but my feet wouldn't move. I was a statue, watching a scene unfold that I knew I wasn't supposed to see. "I think it's time we had that talk," the senator said, his tone casual, like he was discussing the weather and not standing in a rundown gas station in the middle of nowhere at 2:30 in the morning. Lou's face went pale. I don't know what you're talking about." The senator's smile faded. "Come now, Lou, we both know that's not true. The file, where is it?" My eyes darted between them, my mind racing. What file? What the hell was going on here? Lou's hand inched towards something under the counter. In a flash, suit guy had his gun out, pointed straight at Lou's head. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," the senator said calmly. Time seemed to stand still. I could hear my own heart pounding in my ears, drowning out the drone of the TV and the hum of the refrigerators. This was it, I thought. This is how I die, caught in the crossfire at some godforsaken truck stop in the middle of Missouri. But then Lou's shoulders slumped in defeat. Slowly, he reached under the counter and pulled out a manila envelope. "Here," he said, his voice cracking. "Take it. Just leave me alone." The senator took the envelope, thumbing through its contents with a satisfied nod. "Thank you, Lou. You've done the right thing." For a moment, I allowed myself to hope. Maybe this would end peacefully. Maybe we'd all walk out of here alive. I should have known better. The gunshot was deafening in the small space. Lou crumpled to the floor, a red stain blossoming on his chest. I flinched, the coffee cup slipping from my hand and shattering on the linoleum. The senator and suit guy turned to me as if just remembering I was there. I raised my hands instinctively, my mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. I wanted to say something, to plead, to bargain, anything, but no words came out. "Unfortunate," the senator said, looking at me with cold eyes. "Wrong place, wrong time." Suit guy raised his gun and I closed my eyes, waiting for the bullet that would end my life. But it never came. Instead, there was a crash, followed by shouting and more gunshots. I opened my eyes to see the rat-faced guy from earlier grappling with suit guy, trying to wrestle the gun away. The senator stood there, shocked, as the two men fought. In the chaos, my paralysis finally broke. I dove behind a shelf of snack foods, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. More shots rang out, and I heard glass shattering and bodies thumping to the floor. Then silence. I don't know how long I stayed there, curled up in a ball among fallen bags of chips and candy bars. It could have been minutes or hours. Finally, I gathered the courage to peek out. The store looked like a war zone. Shelves were overturned, products scattered everywhere. Blood pooled on the floor, mixing with spilled coffee and broken glass. And bodies, 3 of them, motionless. With shaking hands, I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. As I waited for the police to arrive, a million thoughts raced through my mind. Who were these people? What was in that envelope, and how the hell had I gotten mixed up in all this? I sat there on the floor of Lou's Gas & Go, surrounded by the aftermath of violence, and I realized something. The life I'd been running from, the ghosts I'd been trying to outpace on the open road, they were nothing compared to this. I'd witnessed something I was never meant to see, and there was no running from it. As the distant wail of sirens grew louder, I made a decision. No more running. It was time to face whatever came next head on. Because sometimes the only way out is through. And sometimes the last stop on the road turns out to be just the beginning. Story 11. I've always said that truck stops are like miniature cities, islands of civilization in a sea of asphalt and diesel fumes. But that night at Big Earl's Truck Haven, I learned they can become war zones too. And let me tell you, when you're caught between 2 rival gangs with more firepower than sense, suddenly that cramped sleeper cab starts looking like the safest place in the world. The name's Derek, and I've been hauling freight across the lower 48 for the better part of 2 decades. I've seen my share of crazy stuff out on the road, but nothing could have prepared me for what went down that muggy July night in eastern Oklahoma. I'd been on the road for 14 hours straight, pushing hard to make a delivery deadline in St. Louis. My eyes were gritty, my back was killing me, and I was running on nothing but gas station coffee and sheer stubbornness. When I saw the glowing sign for Big Earl's looming on the horizon, it was like a beacon of hope. Hot food, a shower, maybe even a few hours of shut-eye in a real bed. It all sounded like heaven. As I pulled my rig into the sprawling lot, I noticed there were a lot more motorcycles than usual parked in the shadows. Not your weekend warrior types either, but serious machines, choppers, street fighters, the kind of bikes that scream trouble from a mile away. I hesitated for a moment, but my growling stomach and aching muscles overruled my caution. Besides, I figured bikers need to eat and sleep just like the rest of us, right? Boy, was I wrong. The diner portion of Big Earl's was packed, a low rumble of conversation punctuated by the clink of cutlery and the sizzle of the grill. I squeezed into a booth near the back, nodding to a couple of fellow truckers I recognized from the road. The waitress, a weathered woman with tired eyes and a name tag that read Darlene, shuffled over. "What'll it be, hun?" she asked, pen poised over her notepad. I was halfway through ordering my usual double cheeseburger, extra fries, and a chocolate shake. When the door burst open, a group of bikers swaggered in, all leather jackets and wild beards. Their leader, a mountain of a man with arms like tree trunks, scanned the room with cold eyes. The diner fell silent, tension crackling in the air like static electricity. I noticed patches on their jackets, a snarling wolf's head ringed by the words Lone Wolves MC. Even I'd heard whispers about these guys on the road. They were bad news into everything from drug running to protection rackets. The leader's gaze settled on a table near the front, where another group of bikers sat. These ones wore jackets emblazoned with a burning skull, the Iron Demons, if I remembered correctly. Rivals of the Lone Wolves and just as nasty. "Well, well," the Lone Wolves leader growled, his voice like gravel in a blender. "Looks like some little puppies wandered into the wrong yard." One of the Iron Demons stood up slowly, his hand drifting towards his waistband. "Funny," he sneered. I was about to say the same thing about some mangy mutts. I glanced around frantically, looking for an exit. But the Lone Wolves were blocking the main door, and I knew the back was for employees only. I was trapped, along with everyone else in this dinner theater from hell. "Now, boys," Darlene said, stepping between the two groups with the weary courage of someone who's seen it all. "You know Big Earl don't allow no trouble in here. Take it outside or take it nowhere." For a moment, I dared to hope that cooler heads would prevail. Then I saw the glint of metal as someone reached for a weapon and all hell broke loose. The first punch thrown sent an iron demon crashing into a table, scattering plates and glasses. Then it was a full-on brawl, fists flying and bodies slamming into booths. I ducked under my table, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my teeth. A gunshot rang out, shattering the overhead light and plunging half the diner into darkness. Screams erupted as patrons scrambled for cover. I saw Darlene army crawling towards the kitchen, dragging a shell-shocked teenage busboy with her. More shots followed, the muzzle flashes illuminating snapshots of chaos, snarling faces, shattered windows, blood splattered on checkerboard linoleum. I curled into a tight ball, hands over my head, praying to whatever God might be listening that I'd make it out of this alive. Something hot and wet splashed across my arm, and I looked up to see one of the truckers I'd nodded to earlier slumped against the booth, clutching his shoulder. Without thinking, I reached out and dragged him under the table with me. "Pressure," I yelled over the din, guiding his hand to the wound. "Keep pressure on it." He nodded, face pale with shock. I yanked off my belt and wound it around his arm as a makeshift tourniquet, my hands slick with his blood. The fight was spilling out into the parking lot now, but that didn't make things any safer inside. Stray bullets were still flying, and I knew it was only a matter of time before the cops showed up. When that happened, anyone still here would be in for a world of hurt, innocent or not. I peered out from under the table, trying to gauge the safest route to the exit. That's when I locked eyes with a young woman huddled in the booth across from me. She couldn't have been more than 20, and the terror on her face made her look even younger. I hesitated for a split second, every instinct screaming at me to just save myself. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't leave her there. "Hey," I whispered urgently, motioning to her. "Come on." She shook her head, frozen with fear. "Look," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "When I say go, we're going to make a run for it, okay? Stay low, follow me, and don't stop for anything." She stared at me for what felt like an eternity, then gave a tiny nod. I turned to the wounded trucker. "Can you walk?" He gritted his teeth and nodded. "All right," I said, taking a deep breath. 3, 2, 1, go. We burst out from under the table and ran hunched over towards the door, dodging fallen chairs and shattered glass. My ears were ringing from the gunfire, sweat and blood stinging my eyes. But we kept moving. We were almost to the exit when a burly lone wolf stumbled backwards into our path, grappling with an iron demon. Without thinking, I lowered my shoulder and plowed into them both, sending us all sprawling. "Keep going!" I yelled to the others as I scrambled to my feet. We burst out into the humid night air, the sounds of sirens growing closer. The parking lot was a war zone. Overturned bikes, small fires burning, bikers locked in brutal combat. "This way!" I shouted, leading our little group towards my truck. It wasn't much, but it was armored, and it was the only safe place I could think of. We were halfway there when a shot rang out and the young woman cried out in pain. I turned to see her stumbling, clutching her leg. Without breaking stride, I scooped her up in my arms and kept running. By some miracle, we made it to the truck. I yanked open the passenger door and practically threw the girl inside, then helped the wounded trucker climb up after her. I sprinted around to the driver's side, my lungs burning, adrenaline coursing through my veins. As I turned the key, I saw red and blue lights flooding the parking lot. Cops swarmed in, shouting orders that were drowned out by more gunfire. I threw the truck into gear and peeled out of there, tires squealing. We drove in tense silence for miles. The only sounds, the girl's quiet sobs and the trucker's labored breathing. Finally, when I was sure we weren't being followed, I pulled over at a well-lit rest stop. "Okay," I said, turning to my shell-shocked passengers, "let's get you two some help." As I called 911 and did my best to tend to their wounds, I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. Here I was, a simple trucker who just wanted a burger and a bed, playing hero and fleeing a freaking gang war. But as I looked at the grateful faces of the two people I'd helped save, I realized something. Sometimes life puts you in impossible situations. Sometimes you find yourself caught in the crossfire, and when that happens, you've got two choices: run away or step up. Me, I'm glad I stepped up, because at the end of the day, we're all just trying to make it down this long, strange road called life. And sometimes the best thing you can do is help a fellow traveler along the way, even if it means taking a detour through hell to do it. Story 12. The smell of diesel always meant safety to me. Until that night on Route 50 when it became the scent of my nightmares. I'd been driving trucks for over 2 decades and I thought I'd seen it all. Lot lizards, highway bandits, crazy four-wheelers, you name it. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened that moonless night in the Nevada desert. The cab of my Peterbilt 389 was my second home. I knew every squeak, every rattle like the back of my hand. So when I heard that faint metallic ping coming from somewhere beneath me, I knew something was off. I pulled over onto the shoulder, gravel crunching under my tires. The cool night air hit me as I climbed down from the cab, flashlight in hand. Everything looked normal at first glance. Then I saw it, a small puddle forming under the fuel tank. "Damn," I muttered, crouching down for a closer look. The leak was slow but steady. Must have hit some debris on the road. I'd have to limp to the next truck stop and get it patched up. I climbed back in and fired up the engine, keeping one eye on the fuel gauge. The nearest stop was about 30 miles ahead. I should just make it if I took it easy. The miles ticked by slowly. The usual hum of the tires on asphalt felt ominous now. Every flash of headlights in my mirror made me tense up. Out here in the middle of nowhere, you start to feel real small, real quick when things go wrong. Finally, I saw it. The glowing sign of the Cactus Creek truck stop. I breathed a sigh of relief as I pulled off the highway. The lot was pretty empty. Just a couple other rigs and some beat-up pickups scattered around. I eased into a spot near the diesel pumps and killed the engine. The silence felt heavy after hours of road noise. I sat there for a moment, gathering myself. Just a quick patch job, and I'd be back on schedule. That's when I noticed the guy. He was leaning against one of the pumps, hands in his pockets, watching me. Something about him set off alarm bells in my head. Maybe it was the way he stood there, too still, like a coyote eyeing its prey. I hesitated, one hand on the door handle. Part of me wanted to just start up and get the hell out of there, but I knew I wouldn't make it far on fumes. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door and climbed down. The guy straightened up and started walking towards me. I could see now that he was youngish, maybe early 30s, with close-cropped hair and a lean, wiry build. "Evening," he called out, voice friendly enough. "Having some trouble?" I nodded, keeping my distance. Just a small leak, nothing major. He was closer now, and I could see his eyes darting around, never quite meeting mine. "That's a shame, nasty place to break down." "Yeah, well, better here than 20 miles back," I said, gesturing towards the office. "I'm going to go see about getting it patched up." "Oh, I wouldn't bother with that," he said, his tone shifting. "See, me and my friends, we've got a little business proposition for you." My stomach dropped. As if on cue, 2 more guys melted out of the shadows. One was built like a linebacker, while the other was rail thin with tattoos crawling up his neck. I took a step back, bumping into my truck. "Look, fellas, I don't want any trouble. I'm just passing through." The first guy smiled, but it never reached his eyes. "No trouble at all. We just need to borrow your rig for a bit. You sit tight and everyone goes home happy." My mind raced. 3 of them, 1 of me. No weapons unless you count my tire iron. And even if I could get to it, I wasn't exactly in fighting shape these days. "My cargo's nothing special," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just machine parts, not worth much to anyone but the buyer." The big guy chuckled. "Oh, we ain't interested in your cargo, old-timer. It's that nice, spacious trailer we're after. Got some, shall we say, special deliveries of our own to make." I felt sick. I'd heard stories of truckers being forced into running drugs or worse. Never thought it would happen to me. "I can't do that," I said, straightening up. "I won't." The first guy's smile vanished. "I don't think you understand the situation here, Pops. This isn't a request." He reached behind his back, and I saw the glint of metal. My heart pounded in my ears. "Now," he continued, "here's what's going to happen. You're going to hand over your keys, nice and slow. Then you're going to take a little nap while we borrow your rig. When you wake up, it'll be parked right back here, good as new. You go on your merry way, and everybody wins." I looked from face to face, searching for any hint of mercy. There was none. "And if I refuse?" I asked, already knowing the answer. The tattooed guy stepped forward, cracking his knuckles. "Then things get real unpleasant for you. And we still take the truck." I closed my eyes for a moment, weighing my options. There weren't many. "All right," I said finally, reaching slowly into my pocket. "You win." I held out the keys, jangling them slightly. The leader reached for them, a triumphant smirk on his face. That's when I made my move. I threw the keys as hard as I could, aiming for the darkness beyond the lot. They sailed through the air, glinting once in the fluorescent light before disappearing into the scrub. "You son of a—" the leader snarled, but I was already moving. I dove for the open door of my cab, scrambling up and in. I slammed it shut just as the big guy reached me, his meaty fist slamming against the window. My hands shook as I fumbled for the spare key I kept hidden under the seat. Found it, jammed it into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I threw it into gear. The tires spun, kicking up gravel. I could see the three of them in my mirror, shouting and gesturing wildly. I peeled out of the lot, heart racing. A glance at the fuel gauge showed me hovering just above empty. I had maybe 20 miles tops before I was dead in the water. My mind whirled as I sped down the dark highway. I couldn't go back the way I came. They'd be waiting. Couldn't make it to the next town. My phone was dead, so no calling for help. That's when I remembered. The old fire road. Years ago, on one of my first runs out this way, a local had told me about it. An old dirt track that branched off from the highway, leading up into the hills. It wasn't on any maps, and most folks had forgotten about it. I strained my eyes, searching the darkness. There, a faded wooden sign barely visible in my headlights. I wrenched the wheel hard, the trailer fishtailing behind me as I left the asphalt. The unpaved road was rough, jolting me in my seat as I pushed forward. Branches scraped against the sides of the truck. I killed my lights, relying on the faint moonlight filtering through the trees. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I saw a small clearing up ahead. I nosed the truck in, trying to position it so it wouldn't be visible from the main road. Just as I cut the engine, it sputtered and died. Empty. I sat there in the darkness, listening to the tick of the cooling engine and my own ragged breathing. What the hell was I going to do now? I was miles from anywhere with no fuel and no phone. Those guys were probably already combing the area for me, and even if they didn't find me, I was looking at a long, dangerous hike through rattlesnake country. As the adrenaline faded, exhaustion hit me like a ton of bricks. I knew I should get moving, find help somehow, but my body refused to cooperate. I'll just rest my eyes for a minute, I thought. Just until sunrise. A sharp rapping on the window jerked me awake. I sat up with a start, momentarily confused by my surroundings. Then it all came flooding back. Slowly, I turned to look out the driver's side window. My heart nearly stopped. It was a cop. "Everything all right in there?" he called, voice muffled through the glass. I cracked the window, relief washing over me. "Officer, am I glad to see you. I've had one hell of a night." Over the next hour, I told him everything. The leak, the attempted hijacking, my mad dash into the hills. He listened patiently, jotting notes in a little pad. "You did the right thing," he said when I finished. "Those guys have been operating in the area for months. We've been trying to catch them in the act." He radioed for backup and a tow truck. As we waited, he filled me in on the details. Turns out the gang had been forcing truckers to run drugs and weapons across state lines. Those who refused often turned up in shallow graves out in the desert. "Looks like Lady Luck was on your side tonight," the officer said, clapping me on the shoulder. I nodded, feeling the weight of just how close I'd come to disaster. "Guess the old girl was watching out for me," I said, patting the worn leather of my seat. As the first rays of sunlight began to peek over the hills, I heard the rumble of engines approaching. Cavalry's here, I thought. I climbed down from the cab on shaky legs, squinting in the early morning light. For the first time in my life, the sight of a tow truck brought a smile to my face. The officer was conferring with his colleagues, gesturing towards the road. He caught my eye and gave me a thumbs up. They'd caught the bastards trying to flee town. As they hooked up my rig to the tow truck, I took a moment to really look at her. Scratched, dented, and caked with dust, but still standing, just like me. I patted her fender gently. "Thanks for not giving up on me, old girl," I murmured. The tow truck driver approached, wiping his hands on a rag. "Ready to roll?" he asked. I took one last look around at the lonely stretch of highway that had almost been my undoing, at the hidden dirt road that had been my salvation, at the first pink streaks of dawn painting the sky. "Yeah," I said, climbing up into the passenger seat. "Let's go home." As we pulled away, leaving a cloud of dust in our wake, I knew one thing for certain. I'd be giving Route 50 a wide berth from now on, and maybe investing in some better locks. But I also knew I'd be back on the road soon enough, because out here with nothing but 18 wheels and an open highway, that's where I belonged, even if it meant facing down a few demons along the way. Story 13. The Mona Lisa smiled at me from the back of my trailer, and I knew I was in way over my head. It all started with a simple delivery run from Chicago to New York, just another job, or so I thought. 30 years on the road, and I'd never had a load quite like this one. The dispatch came in late Friday afternoon. "Got a rush job for you, Frank," Marge's gravelly voice crackled through my cell phone. "High-value cargo. Confidential, you up for it?" I should have known then that something was off, but the promise of a fat bonus clouded my judgment. "Sure thing, Marge. What's the pickup?" "Art gallery in Chicago. Be there at midnight sharp. They'll have everything ready to go." Midnight. That should have been my second red flag, but I just grunted an affirmative and started plotting my route. The gallery was a swanky place in the Gold Coast neighborhood, all gleaming glass and polished steel. As I pulled up, a couple of guys in crisp suits were waiting by the loading dock. They looked more like Secret Service than art handlers. "You Frank?" the taller one asked, his eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. "At midnight. Indoors." I nodded, climbing down from my rig. "That's me. Got some fancy paintings to move." He didn't smile. "Something like that. Back the trailer up to the dock. We'll handle the loading." I did as I was told, watching in my side mirror as they rolled out several large crates on dollies. Each one was marked with warnings: "Fragile" and "Handle with care" in big red letters. Once everything was secured, the tall guy handed me a thick envelope. "Your route's in here. Stick to it exactly. No stops except for fuel. You'll be met at the delivery point by our people." "What's in the crates?" I asked, curiosity getting the better of me. He fixed me with a stare that could freeze hell itself. "Above your pay grade, driver. Just get it there in one piece." With that, they melted back into the shadows of the gallery. I climbed into my cab, a knot forming in my gut. This wasn't just some rushed delivery of expensive paintings, this was something else entirely. I tore open the envelope as soon as I hit the highway. Inside was a detailed route that avoided major cities and stuck to back roads whenever possible. And underneath that, my blood ran cold. A photo of my sister and her kids, smiling at a backyard barbecue. Scrawled across it in red marker: "Insurance." My hand shook as I crumpled the photo and shoved it into my pocket. What the hell had I gotten myself into? The first few hours passed in a blur of paranoia. Every set of headlights in my rearview mirror looked like a potential tail. Every unexpected sound from the trailer had me imagining priceless artwork tumbling to the floor. Dawn was just breaking when I pulled into a truck stop for fuel. As I stood there watching the numbers tick up on the pump, a sleek black SUV pulled in behind my rig. A woman stepped out, all business in a sharp pantsuit. She walked up to me like she owned the place. "Everything going smoothly, Frank?" I tried to keep my voice steady. "Who are you, She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Let's just say I'm here to make sure our cargo reaches its destination without any complications." "Look, lady," I said, anger overriding my fear for a moment. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but leave my family out of it." Her smile vanished. "Oh, Frank, your family's been involved since the moment you took this job. But don't worry, deliver the goods and they'll be just fine." She turned on her heel and strode back to the SUV. As she opened the door, she called back over her shoulder: "We'll be watching, don't disappoint us." The rest of the trip was a nightmare of frayed nerves and cold sweats. I stuck to the prescribed route like my life depended on it, because I was pretty sure it did. It was just past midnight when I finally pulled up to the delivery address, a nondescript warehouse on the outskirts of New York City. A group of men in suits were waiting, along with a couple of unmarked vans. As soon as I cut the engine, they swarmed around the trailer. I watched in my mirror as they quickly and efficiently unloaded the crates, transferring them to the vans. The woman from the truck stop appeared at my window. "Nice work, Frank. One last thing before you go away." She handed me a burner phone. "Wait for our call. You'll be making a few more trips for us." I opened my mouth to protest, but she cut me off. "Unless you'd rather explain to the FBI how you ended up transporting stolen artwork across state lines." My jaw snapped shut. She smirked and walked away, leaving me sitting there in stunned silence. It was only then, in that moment of quiet dread, that I noticed one of the crates had been left partially open in the rush to unload. And peeking out from beneath the packing material was the unmistakable edge of a gilded frame. I blinked, sure I was seeing things. But no. There she was, the enigmatic smile of the Mona Lisa, barely visible in the dim light of the warehouse. My mind reeled. This couldn't be real. The actual Mona Lisa was safely hanging in the Louvre, wasn't it? But deep down, I knew. This was no reproduction. I had just unwittingly played a part in one of the biggest art heists in history. The burner phone buzzed in my hand, making me jump. A text message flashed on the screen. "Good job. Stay ready for next assignment." I stared at it for a long moment, then slowly raised my eyes to the rearview mirror. The warehouse was empty now, the vans long gone. It was just me and my thoughts, and the crushing weight of what I'd done. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed by indecision. Part of me wanted to floor it, to run as far and fast as I could. Another part screamed to go to the police, to come clean before this went any further. But the image of my sister and her kids kept flashing through my mind, the unspoken threat hanging over their heads. In the end, I did the only thing I could. I put the rig in gear and pulled away from the warehouse, leaving behind any illusions I had about being just an innocent driver caught up in something beyond my control. I was in it now, for better or worse. The next few weeks were a blur of similar runs, always at night, always taking circuitous routes to avoid major highways and checkpoints. I never saw the artwork directly again, but I knew. Priceless masterpieces stolen from museums and private collections around the world were passing through my hands. Each time the burner phone would buzz with a new pickup location. Each time I'd arrive to find the same efficient team loading my trailer with unmarked crates. And each time I'd die a little inside, knowing I was digging myself deeper into a hole I might never escape. I tried to justify it to myself. I was protecting my family. I was just the driver, not the mastermind. But the excuses rang hollow in the quiet hours of the night, with nothing but an empty road ahead of me and a trailer full of ill-gotten treasures behind. It was during one of these late-night hauls somewhere in the Appalachians that things finally came to a head. The burner phone rang. Not a text this time, but an actual call. I answered with trepidation. "Change of plans?" a terse voice said. "There's a rest stop 2 miles ahead. Pull in there and wait." The line went dead before I could ask any questions. My palms were slick with sweat as I guided the big rig into the deserted rest area. The only other vehicle was a battered RV, its curtains drawn tight. I killed the engine and waited, every muscle tense. Minutes ticked by, stretching into what felt like hours. Suddenly there was a sharp rap on my door. I nearly jumped out of my skin. A man in a rumpled suit stood there, badge held up to the window. FBI. "Step out of the vehicle, sir," he said, voice firm but not unkind. My heart pounded as I climbed down from the cab on shaky legs. This was it, the end of the line. But as the agent began to speak, I realized this wasn't an arrest. It was a lifeline. "We know you've been coerced into this operation," he said, his eyes full of understanding. "We've had our eye on this ring for months, but we need your help to bring them down." Relief washed over me, followed quickly by a wave of guilt. "My family," he held up a hand, "are safe. We've had them under protection since this started. They were never in any real danger." I sagged against the side of my truck, the weight of weeks of fear and stress suddenly lifting. The agent continued, "What we need now is for you to make one more run, but this time we'll be waiting at the other end." I straightened up, a spark of determination replacing the guilt in my gut. "Tell me what you need me to do." As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, I climbed back into my rig with a new sense of purpose. The trailer behind me was loaded not with priceless art, but with tracking devices and a small army of undercover agents. I pulled out onto the highway, the burner phone silent in my pocket. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. Whatever happened next, I knew one thing for certain: this would be my last delivery. After this, I was done with the open road. But as I settled into the familiar rhythm of the drive, watching the miles tick by on the odometer, I couldn't help but smile. One last job, one chance to make things right, and who knows, Maybe I'd even get to see the Mona Lisa smile again this time, safely back where she belonged. Story 14. The first rock shattered my windshield at 70 miles per hour, and I knew this was no ordinary case of road rage. I'd been driving trucks for the better part of 2 decades, and I'd seen my fair share of crazy out on the open road. But nothing could have prepared me for the night Sterling Trucking decided to take me out. It was supposed to be a routine haul, Minneapolis to Seattle, just me and 40,000 pounds of auto parts humming along I-90. The kind of run I could do in my sleep. Maybe that's why I didn't notice them at first. The black Peterbilt had been shadowing me for at least an hour before I caught on. Always there in my mirrors, hanging back just far enough to not raise suspicion. But once I spotted it, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something wasn't right. I reached for my CB radio, thinking I'd check in with some of the other drivers in the area. That's when all hell broke loose. The rock came out of nowhere, spider-webbing my windshield in an instant. I swerved hard, nearly jackknifing as I fought to keep control. My heart was pounding so loud I could barely hear myself think. "What the hell?" I muttered, trying to peer through the cracked glass. That's when I saw them. 3 more trucks boxing me in. The Peterbilt behind, a Freightliner on my left, and a Kenworth closing in fast on my right. All of them sporting the unmistakable silver and blue logo of Sterling Trucking. My blood ran cold. Sterling was our biggest competitor, known for their cutthroat tactics. But this was insanity. I grabbed the CB again, this time yelling into it. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Big Red. I'm under attack on I-90 westbound. Any drivers in the area? I need help." Static was my only answer. The Kenworth pulled up alongside me, so close I could see the driver grinning like a madman. He swerved toward me, his trailer scraping against mine with a horrific shriek of metal on metal. I yanked the wheel hard, barely avoiding being run off the road. My trailer fishtailed wildly, threatening to jackknife. By some miracle, I managed to straighten out, but I knew I couldn't keep this up for long. The adrenaline was pumping now, my mind racing as fast as my rig. Why were they doing this? Sure, competition in the trucking world was fierce, but this was attempted murder. Another rock slammed into my cab, this time taking out my passenger side mirror. I flinched, ducking instinctively. When I looked up, I saw we were approaching a long downhill stretch. If I was going to make a move, it had to be now. I gritted my teeth and did something they'd never taught me in trucking school. I hit the gas. My old Freightliner roared in protest as I pushed her well beyond the safe speed for a full load. The speedometer crept past 80, then 85. The whole cab was shaking, rattling like it might fly apart at any second. But it was working. I was pulling ahead, the gap between me and my pursuers slowly widening. I allowed myself a small flicker of hope. Maybe I could outrun them after all. That's when I saw it. A roadblock up ahead. 2 more Sterling trucks parked sideways across the highway, completely blocking both lanes. My mind went blank for a second. This couldn't be happening. It was too well coordinated, too insane. But there it was, getting closer by the second. I had a split second to make a decision. Try to thread the needle between the trucks and risk taking out not just myself, but potentially innocent motorists? Or do something even crazier? I wrenched the wheel hard to the right, aiming for the steep embankment that ran alongside the highway. It was a desperate move, but it was the only shot I had. The world turned sideways as my rig left the pavement. I was thrown against my seatbelt, my head slamming into the side window. The roar of the engine was replaced by the deafening crunch of metal and the squeal of tires desperately seeking traction. We rolled once, twice, 3 times down the embankment. Each impact felt like a sledgehammer to my body. I lost all sense of direction, of up or down. All I could do was hang on and pray. Finally, mercifully, we came to a stop. I was upside down, held in place only by my seatbelt. The taste of blood filled my mouth, and every inch of me screamed in pain. But I was alive. Through the shattered remains of my windshield, I could see the flashing lights of emergency vehicles up on the highway. Someone must have called it in. I let out a shaky breath, relief washing over me. That relief was short-lived. A face appeared at my window, one of the Sterling drivers. He was saying something, but I couldn't make it out through the ringing in my ears. Then I saw the glint of metal in his hand. A gun. Fear gave me strength I didn't know I had. I fumbled for my seatbelt release, falling hard onto the roof of the cab as it gave way. Every movement was agony, but the alternative was worse. I crawled out the broken window on the opposite side, glass cutting into my palms. I could hear shouting now, the sound of running feet. I stumbled to my feet, nearly falling as a wave of dizziness hit me. The woods at the bottom of the embankment were dark and thick. I plunged into them without a second thought, branches whipping at my face as I ran. Behind me, I could hear the shouts getting closer. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that dark forest. Every shadow looked like a pursuer, every snapping twig like a gunshot. My lungs burned, my legs felt like lead, but I kept going. Finally, I couldn't run anymore. I collapsed behind a fallen tree, gasping for air. The forest was quiet now, save for the pounding of my heart. Had I lost them? Or were they out there still, searching? As my breathing slowed, the reality of my situation began to sink in. I was alone in the woods, injured, with no idea where I was or how far I'd run. My truck was destroyed, along with any evidence of what had happened. Would anyone believe my story? Or would Sterling's lawyers twist it, make me out to be some reckless driver who'd endangered lives? The sound of a helicopter overhead made me flinch. Search and rescue, or something more sinister. I huddled there behind that log for what felt like hours, jumping at every sound. As the adrenaline wore off, the pain set in. My ribs ached with every breath, and I was pretty sure my left arm was broken. Just when I was starting to think I might die out here, I heard it. A voice calling out, "Mr. Johnson, Carl Johnson, it's the state police. If you can hear me, call out." I wanted to shout, to run toward that voice, but fear held me back. What if it was a trick? The voice came again, closer this time. "Mr. Johnson, we know what happened. You're safe now. Sterling Trucking is in custody." Something in the tone, the sincerity of it, broke through my paranoia. I gathered what little strength I had left and called out, "Here! I'm over here!" The next few hours passed in a blur of paramedics, police statements, and hospital lights. X-rays confirmed 2 broken ribs and a fractured arm, along with a concussion and more cuts and bruises than I could count. It wasn't until the next morning, when a grim-faced detective came to take my official statement, that I learned the full story. Sterling Trucking had been running a massive drug smuggling operation, using their legitimate business as a cover. They'd caught wind that our company was about to underbid them on a major contract, which would have led to increased scrutiny of their routes. So they decided to take out one of our top drivers, me, and make it look like an accident. What they hadn't counted on was a rookie driver in their crew getting cold feet. He'd called in an anonymous tip just minutes before they sprang their trap, giving the police just enough time to mobilize. The detective assured me that Sterling's entire operation was going down. Arrests were being made up and down the supply chain. My ordeal, as horrific as it had been, had inadvertently blown the lid off one of the biggest drug busts in state history. As he got up to leave, the detective paused at the door. "One more thing, Mr. Johnson. There's a representative from your company here to see you. Says he has an offer for you, something about a desk job if you want it." I let out a laugh that turned into a groan as my ribs protested. A desk job. After 20 years on the road, the idea should have terrified me. But as I lay there, battered and bruised in that hospital bed, it sounded pretty damn good. The open road would always be a part of me. The rhythm of the highway, the freedom of a full tank of diesel and an open horizon, that doesn't leave you easy. But maybe it was time for a change. Time to let someone else dodge the crazies and the road rage and the murderous competition. Besides, I had one hell of a story to tell around the water cooler. As I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't help but smile. I'd survived. I'd helped bring down a criminal empire, and I never had to worry about another truck trying to run me off the road again. Not a bad way to end a career, all things considered. Story 15. The first rule of Truck Stop Fight Club is you don't talk about Truck Stop Fight Club. The second rule is, if you lose, you haul their load. No questions asked. I'd been driving 18-wheelers for the better part of 2 decades, and I thought I'd seen it all. Lot lizards, highway bandits, crazy 4-wheelers cutting me off, you name it. But nothing could have prepared me for the night I stumbled into the dark underbelly of the trucking world. It was a typical Tuesday night run. I was hauling a load of electronics from Chicago to Denver, nothing special. I'd pulled into the Thornton Travel Plaza just outside of Des Moines for a quick pit stop. Fuel up, grab some coffee, maybe catch a few winks in the sleeper cab before hitting the road again. The plaza was busier than usual for a weeknight. Rigs of all shapes and sizes packed the lot, their chrome glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights. As I made my way to the main building, I noticed something odd. A steady stream of drivers heading around back, all with the same purposeful stride. Curiosity got the better of me. I followed at a distance, my instincts telling me something wasn't right. As I rounded the corner of the building, I heard it, the unmistakable sounds of a fight. Grunts, the meaty thwack of fists on flesh, and a crowd cheering. I pushed my way through the throng of bodies, the smell of sweat and diesel thick in the air. What I saw in the center of that makeshift ring stopped me cold. Two drivers, stripped to the waist, were going at it like their lives depended on it. One was a mountain of a man, all muscle and tattoos. The other was leaner, quicker, but sporting a nasty gash above his eye. They circled each other warily, neither willing to give an inch. "What the hell is this?" I muttered, more to myself than anyone else. A grizzled old-timer next to me overheard. He turned, sizing me up with eyes that had seen too many miles and not enough sleep. "You new here, boy? This here's the only real justice we got out on these roads." He went on to explain, his voice low and conspiratorial. Truck Stop Fight Club, he called it. A way for drivers to settle disputes, prove their worth, or just blow off steam after too many lonely nights on the asphalt. "But here's the kicker," he said, a glint in his eye. "Loser takes the winner's load. No questions asked, no dispatch involved. You win, you get a night off. You lose, you better hope that load ain't too heavy." I watched, transfixed, as the fight reached its climax. The bigger guy caught his opponent with a wild haymaker, sending him sprawling to the oil-stained concrete. The crowd roared its approval. "We got a winner," someone shouted. "Big Mike keeps his streak alive." As the crowd began to disperse, I noticed a couple of guys helping the loser to his feet. They were already talking logistics, arranging the handoff of Big Mike's load. I should have walked away right then. Should have fueled up and got back on the road, pretending I'd never seen any of this. But something kept me rooted to the spot. Maybe it was the adrenaline still pumping through my veins, or maybe it was the realization that after 20 years of driving, I'd finally found something that made me feel alive again. The old-timer must have sensed my interest. He clapped a hand on my shoulder, his grip surprisingly strong. "You look like you could handle yourself in the ring. Why don't you stick around? Next bout's starting soon." I hesitated, every rational part of my brain screaming at me to leave. But then I thought about the long, lonely nights ahead, the monotony of the highway, the same truck stops, the same greasy food. What did I have to lose? "All right," I heard myself say. "I'm in it." The next few minutes were a blur. Before I knew it, I was standing in the center of that makeshift ring, my shirt discarded, fists raised. Across from me stood a wiry guy with a wild look in his eyes. Johnny Two Loads, they called him. Apparently, he had a reputation for taking on extra hauls just for the thrill of it. "You know the rules," the impromptu referee growled. "Fight's over when one of you can't continue. No low blows, no weapons. Winner walks, loser hauls. Now let's see some action." Johnny came at me like a tornado, all wild swings and unpredictable movement. I backpedaled, trying to find my footing on the slick concrete. His fist grazed my chin, sending a jolt through my entire body. This wasn't some barroom scuffle. This guy meant business. I raised my guard, years of high school boxing coming back to me in a rush. Johnny pressed his advantage, backing me up against the wall of spectators. But in his eagerness, he left himself open. I saw my chance and took it, driving a hard right into his solar plexus. Johnny's eyes went wide as the air rushed out of him. He staggered back, giving me the space I needed. I pressed forward, landing a solid combination to his head and body. The crowd roared its approval, but Johnny was tougher than he looked. He shook off the hits and came back at me with renewed fury. We traded blows in the center of the ring, neither of us willing to give ground. My knuckles were raw, my ribs aching from the punishment, but I'd never felt more alive. In the end, it came down to endurance. Johnny had the speed, but I had the stamina from years of loading and unloading trailers. As the fight wore on, his punches lost their sting. His breathing became ragged. I saw my opening and took it. A solid right cross sent Johnny stumbling. I followed up with a left hook that caught him flush on the jaw. He went down hard, his head bouncing off the concrete with a sickening thud. The crowd erupted. Hands clapped me on the back, voices raised in celebration. But all I could focus on was Johnny, lying motionless on the ground. Had I gone too far? To my relief, he stirred after a few tense moments. A couple of guys helped him to his feet, and he gave me a shaky nod of respect. "Good fight," he mumbled through swollen lips. As the adrenaline faded, the reality of what I'd done began to sink in. I'd won, sure, but now I was committed. Johnny's load was my responsibility now, no questions asked. The old-timer who'd first clued me in appeared at my elbow, pressing a scrap of paper into my hand. "Johnny's truck info and delivery details," he said with a wink. "Better get moving. That load of fresh seafood ain't gonna deliver itself to Salt Lake City." My heart sank. Salt Lake City was in the opposite direction of my original Denver run. I'd have to call my dispatch, make up some excuse about a breakdown. And then there was the small matter of my own trailer, still fully loaded in the parking lot. But as I looked around at the faces of my fellow drivers, I saw something I hadn't seen in years on the road. A sense of community, of shared purpose. These men and women might be settling their differences with their fists, but there was a code of honor here, a respect for the unwritten rules of the road. I made my decision then and there. I'd see this through wherever it took me. I'd deliver Johnny's load and come back for mine, even if it meant driving straight through without sleep, because now I was part of something bigger than myself. I was part of Truck Stop Fight Club. As I headed for Johnny's rig, my body aching but my spirit soaring, I couldn't help but smile. The open road had always been my home, but now I had a family to go with it. A bruised, battered, slightly crazy family, but a family nonetheless. The next few months were a whirlwind. Word spread quickly about the new guy who could hold his own in the ring. I found myself looking forward to those clandestine meetings behind truck stops and warehouses. Sometimes I won, sometimes I lost, but every fight left me feeling more alive than I had in years. Of course, it wasn't without its challenges. Explaining to dispatch why I was suddenly taking such circuitous routes became an art form. Bridge out on I-80 became my go-to excuse. My on-time delivery percentage took a hit, but the thrill of never knowing where I'd end up next more than made up for it. There were close calls, too. Like the night a state trooper almost stumbled upon one of our fights at a rest area off I-65. We scattered like roaches, leaving nothing but a few bloodstains on the pavement as evidence. Or the time I had to talk my way out of a way station inspection with bruised ribs and a black eye. "You should see the other guy," I joked weakly. The inspector just shook his head and waved me through. But for every hairy moment, there were a dozen that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with trucking in the first place. The camaraderie of the open road, the satisfaction of a job well done. And now, the added rush of knowing that any stop could turn into an impromptu bout. As weeks turned to months, I found myself climbing the unofficial rankings of Truck Stop Fight Club. Drivers I'd once idolized were now calling me out, eager to test themselves against the new blood. I won more than I lost, but every fight taught me something new about myself, about my limits, about the unbreakable spirit of the long-haul trucker. Looking back now, I know it couldn't have lasted forever. Sooner or later, someone was bound to get hurt too badly, or the wrong person would find out and blow the whistle on the whole operation. But for that brief, glorious time, I was part of something truly special. These days, I'm back to running my regular routes. The bruises have faded, the cuts healed. But every now and then, when I pull into a truck stop on a quiet night, I'll catch a glimpse of a few drivers headed around back with that familiar, purposeful stride. And I'll smile, knowing that somewhere out there, Truck Stop Fight Club lives on. The first rule might be that you don't talk about it, but the memories, those I'll carry with me for the rest of my days on the long, lonely highway.